All right, welcome to the WordPress Block Editor Tips and Tricks workshop. My name is Chris Norcross. I work in the Academic Technology Resources Center. And this workshop is essentially it's kind of it's sort of an advanced workshop, maybe more intermediate, about how to use the block editor. So I'm going to cover some of the blocks and tricks that I didn't show in my using the WordPress Block Editor workshop. Now, I'm going to be primarily covering these blocks that are listed here, so columns, buttons, and so forth. Some of these are not terribly useful, so I'll just kind of show them off real quickly, but there's a couple here that are very useful. And I would say actually columns is one of the more useful blocks once you learn how to start learning how to use that one. And then the buttons block is also really useful. It's starting to become more and more common. So those are some of the ones I'll spend the most time on, I guess, in a way. And then the rest of them are just kind of more for fun and rarely used for the most part, but can be useful in the right circumstances. Before I start talking about these blocks, however, I did want to spend a little bit of time talking about the site origin page builder and how that plugin affects using the block editor. So I'm going to jump over to the training system, the WordPress training system, where I'm already logged in. And I'm going to go ahead and head to the dashboard. And what I wanted to show is, first off, the site origin tools are enabled on this site. Not every site has a site origin page builder enabled. And if it isn't enabled, then you can ignore this portion of this workshop, I suppose. But the page builder was something that we used to build kind of complicated and advanced page layouts before the block editor existed. And so now that the block editor exists, it's becoming less necessary, but there's still some cool features about it that are very useful. So that's still fine to use, but it does affect the way the block editor functions in the site, at least with the default settings. So I just want to talk about that for a minute, and then we'll move on to actually talking about blocks. And I should mention, if anybody has any kind of questions or anything while we're going, feel free to chat them, and then I'll also take questions at the end after I'm all done. Don't expect this workshop to take the full hour. I'm going to go ahead and go to the All Pages area, and just show you that because the site origin page builder plugin is active on this site and it has the default settings, if I were to go right now to create a new page, it would not actually create a page with the block editor. In fact, I'll go ahead and click on Add New. And what you see is what we get is a classic editor page. And I've got the visual and text options. And I also have the option of switching it over to using the page builder. So for those of you that have used the site origin page builder plugin, then you're going to be used to this view here. So that's what it looks like when you just hit the button, to add a new page without choosing one of the additional options. The additional options I get are site origin page builder, which when I do that, it just really is just a shortcut to using the page builder tab that I used just a second ago. And this does give me the option to revert back to the classic editor, although sometimes that can cause problems with any site origin page builder content that you have on the page, so be careful of that. But the most important option here is that you do have the opportunity to choose block editor. So for everything I'm talking about today, we're going to be talking about the built-in WordPress block editor. Now, when I insert a block editor page, or if I'm editing an existing block editor page, there is an option to add the site origin layout block. So just because you're using the block editor doesn't mean you can't use the site origin page builder tools. So to do that, I would literally just add that block in, and then it gives me the same options that I'm used to seeing with the site origin page builder. So essentially you can use both. However, what it's not easy to do is to go from a page that is using the site origin page builder just to begin with and convert it to a block editor page. That's not an option directly. But however, it is very easy to take another page and insert it into this particular page. So I've created this site origin page builder layout or site origin layout block, and then I can then choose to insert content from another page on the site. So I'm not going to spend any more time on that particular topic, just because this is just something just for a subset of you that are using the site origin page builder. But I just wanted to show off how you can choose which editor you're going to use when you create a page. One last thing I want to talk about, though, is that there is a setting. If you go into the settings area, or sorry, the site origin area, is the settings. There's an option. Let's see if I can remember where it is. Actually, I think it's a different area. Here it is. Under settings, page builder. Sorry, so it's not under the site origin option. So there's settings, page builder. And from in here, I can choose the option here to use the classic editor for new posts. So that is enabled by default. If I don't want that to happen, I can deselect that box. And I do encourage you to deselect that if you're, once you get comfortable using the block editor, because I think it is the better way to go, especially long-term, the classic editor is going to be phased out, and the site origin page builder more and more, I think, will be used within the block editor rather than as its own editor. Okay, so that's all there is for that. I'm going to go ahead and change that setting to disable that. And now if I go back to the pages area, I'm going to delete this page that was created earlier. Okay, so now if I go to create a new one, you see I still have the same options, but when I click on add new, it should bring me to a block editor page. So, all right, so that's all I wanted to say about the site origin page builder. Just remember there's a site origin layout block that you can use. You don't have to use this button to add it. I can also type /site origin, or it'll come up, site origin layout. It's also possible to insert individual widgets, but I find interesting that inserting the site origin layouts is probably more familiar to you if you've been using the tool before. Okay. All right, let's move on now to what I call the beyond the basics of the blocks for in the editor. And we're going to start off with columns because honestly, columns is a very useful one. There was no easy way to do columns without using the site origin page builder before. So that's one of the reasons why it became so popular. But now we have the ability to do columns block. So I'm going to go ahead and insert the columns block using any of the methods that we've seen in the past. It's already available here for me to choose. I could filter it down by name if I needed to, but I'm going to go ahead and choose columns. And when you choose it, when you insert your column, you do have the option of choosing the layout. Now you can just do a one column. That might seem strange, but there actually, I suppose, could be uses for that. But most of the time, it's going to be multiple columns within the column, the columns block. So in this case, I'm going to say I'll make essentially a 2/3, 1/3 split right there. And I can always go in and add new columns, and if I want to, right, I can add columns very easily. However, in this case, I want to go ahead and insert some content into these columns. And you can see it makes it easy to insert blocks within each column using this plus sign that's inside the column. So that's how easy it is to insert columns. Now you can modify the width after the fact if you need to. I find usually once I select the correct width, it's fine. But if I needed to, I could change the column width here for whatever column I currently have selected. You also can set background colors and text colors. I usually recommend not doing that unless you have a good reason to do that. We've specifically chosen to go with a white background and essentially a very dark gray font that is easy to see. A lot of contrast. So I encourage you to use the defaults when possible. But there are cases where you may need to change the colors of all the content inside of a column or something like that. And you can certainly do that. But over here on the right-hand side of the column, I'm going to insert another block. And in this case, I'm going to insert a buttons block just to show off the next one that I wanted to show you. So here's the buttons block. And by default, it inserts just a single button, and I can give that button some text. So let's just call this one, I'm just going to call it, this would be easy button 1. And then if I hit enter, it will then move me on to a second button, and I can then type in text for that one, button 2. And I can add as many buttons as I need to. You can see it's automatically wrapping into a second line when it needs to. So that's the buttons block when you count all of the buttons plural. And then within each buttons block, you can have multiple buttons. And so there's separate settings for each. So the buttons block, you can set things like the orientation. So if I don't want them to be horizontal, I can make them vertical. I can also set the justification, so I can center them or right align them if I want. I can also tell it not to wrap them in multiple lines. So I can force them to remain on a single line when they're in horizontal orientation. So those are options I get. And there's also some typography options, but right now it's set at the default font. But if I really wanted to go larger font, I certainly could. So maybe I decide that medium looks a little better. And then from there, that's all the options I have for the columns, or sorry, for the buttons block, but I still have some additional options for individual buttons. So first off, individual buttons there's an alternate style called outline you can choose. Although I think you should stick with the fill option. That's more of the standard Palomar styles. At some point, we might take a look at the outline style and modify it to match the Palomar colors better. But we've only done that for the fill style for now. But one thing you can do is change the width settings on a per button basis. So I could change each of these buttons to be 100%. And you can see it's going to take up the width of that column that it's in. So it automatically fills the width of the column. And I can use any of the widths there, fill up 50%, 75%, whatever. But in this case, 100% looks nice because it just fills up that column there. And so now that I have my buttons there really isn't anything else besides the typography stuff. So that's pretty basic as far as what you can control. Now the buttons, ideally, you'd want to actually have them do something, right? So that usually the button text is going to link to something. So in that case, I would select the button text and click on the link button. And then I can then type in the URL where it's going to link to. So we don't want to forget about that. So otherwise it's useless. So maybe I just want to link that one to the Palomar homepage. And then I can go off and do a similar thing for the rest of the buttons. Oops, did not want to do that. All right. All right, so I put a link on the first two buttons, didn't bother with the third button, doesn't matter too much though. And now on the left-hand side, I have still my column to deal with, so I can add some content in there. So in this case, just to be quick and easy, I'm gonna just insert an image in the left-hand side. Just choose one of the images that's already on the site. You normally do want to add in some type of an alt text. So I'm going to put Palomar College graduates. Not sure who's in the actual photo in this case. So you can see it fills in that left column side, space there. So I'm going to go ahead now and just publish this page just so we can preview it. And so now we have our multi-column layout, 2 columns. But one of the things that's really nice though is that it will automatically adjust based on the window size. So you can see everything changes size, things move around to the point where eventually the buttons will drop and stack below that first column because it's the second column. But it still remains looking nice, really nice in there. And then another thing you can do that is really more of a feature of the column is you can do alignments within the column. So if I have the column selected, or actually I guess it's the columns, it's on multiple columns. No, maybe it is the one in single column, let's see. So I'm trying to select single column, there we go, okay. And you see there's options here for inner blocks to use content width. So that doesn't really affect anything for me right now because I'm filling up the width of it. You can see there's an option there. I can set the, again, set the background color for just the one column if you need to. Again, I don't recommend that kind of stuff. So there are, some basic options for the column and then the columns themselves as well. You can control and tell it not to stack on mobile, so it has to stay, in a horizontal order. You can't change the vertical. Again, usually that's what you want on a mobile device. All right, and then there's also vertical line options. So right now I have the column selected, and vertically I can align everything in the middle there. So that might look good. Okay, So that's the columns and the buttons. Those are kind of honestly probably the two more important of the blocks that I'm going to be discussing today. The rest of them are less commonly used, but let's go ahead and take a look at some of them. So for example, we're going to build a quote and a pull quote block just to show the differences between the two of those. So there's just a way of making usually textual content stand out. So down below my columns, outside of my columns, I'm going to go ahead and insert another block, and I'm going to make this one a quote. And you can see it's basically just asking for some text and a citation. So I've got this site over here where I can just copy this quote that I set up for myself. And then the citation, we'll go down here. Right, so there's a quote, which is really just a paragraph where the citation is all a quote is. But there's also the pull quote. So I'm going to add a pull quote now. And you can see it's similar. Let me grab a different quote just for fun. All right, so there's the second one, and I'll go ahead and now preview after saving. So you can see the style differences, because it doesn't do a good job of showing the style in the editor. That's something that we will work on our end, certainly. So, well, Brittany, I see your question there about adding padding to the columns. That's something that actually we're going to have to look into, because we noticed recently that there's not padding in the columns, which can be a problem sometimes, especially like when you add a background color and things like that. So we're working on styling the columns differently, or choosing what options are available. But yeah, that's an issue that I don't think right now you can get that, but yeah, but I think we're working on it basically. So it's something we have to specifically turn on, I think. Okay, but anyways, you can see the quote and the pull quote have different styles, so you can choose which is appropriate. These, you could also stick them in columns if you don't want them to take up the full width. But again, just a way of making text stand out on your page, on your site. And we will probably take a look at that and make it more of a Palomar style at some point. Okay, so the next one I want to cover is the group block. And this one can be useful especially if you have complicated page layouts. So I'm going to go ahead and insert a new block. And in this case, I'm going to insert the group block. Oops. So group. And now that I have the group there, I can add stuff into the group. But one of the things I like to do when I have a group, to make it a little easier on myself, a lot of times I'll use the outline, the block outline view, or the list view. So that's this button up here at the top. And from there, you can actually see where things are on the page. And I can work on getting things inside the group here much easier. So I can, for example, drag the columns to be inside the group, so that now they're a part of the group. I can do the same thing with the other. So if I want all those to be in the group, I can do that. That's weird. I don't know what happened. I think I put the pull quote inside the quotes. There we go. Nope, not what I wanted. All right, messed that one up. There we go. The weird thing is I can't move. Okay, there. Nope. Okay, well, I'll do it the easy way, which is to select it and then just move it down this way. So anyways, I was having trouble dragging it. So there's multiple options of way of moving things up and down, but I find getting things in and out in the groups and columns sometimes can be useful using this list view. You can see it has all the contents listed. So that's kind of a neat little tool there. Okay, so but now that I have them in the group, I can now do things with that group all at once. So I can, in that group, for example, I can say set the background color of the whole group, or I can change the font color of the whole group. So I can take actions on the whole thing. It also allows you to do things like when the group is selected, you can lock the entire group so that things can't be moved around inside it, things like that. So, I don't use the groups a ton, but every once in a while they can be useful. And they do make it harder for you to accidentally drag something from one area to another or delete things. You can when you lock them, for example, you can disable moving them and or deleting them. And it'll apply, and you can have it applied to all the blocks inside it. So it inherits all that. So that's where those features are, that the group feature comes in handy, especially when you're locking multiple things. All right, so that's the group. Next one is a spacer. So a spacer sometimes can be useful. Just sometimes you're just, if you're in a little jam and things are just a little bit too close to each other, then you can add a little space. So let's just say for some reason I needed to have more space in between this quote and the column content above it. Well, I would select an item, and there's multiple ways you can insert blocks, but one thing you can do is insert one before the item here. And the one specifically I want to insert is spacer. And the spacer is something you can, honestly, it's easiest just to drag it and make it the size you want. So it has that much space into it. So this is kind of just a trick, to add more space in. You shouldn't have to use it very often, if at all. You can specify the number of pixels manually. So if I know exactly, I want it to be, exactly 50 pixels, I can do that. And so I'm going to go ahead and just make the spacer, abnormally large, just to should really demonstrate it. And then when I preview, and as you'd expect, it's actually a blank space. So I made the mistake of putting it inside my quote. So that's why it looks like that. So I should fix that. So you can see my spacer's inside my quote accidentally. So I don't want that. So I'm going to try to drag it outside of it here. And now, if I update and view it, now I don't see that gray background there. So again, this is not a practical example here because we didn't need that space, but there's anytime you do need space, you can certainly add it in there. All right, now there's also a separator, which I actually think is slightly more useful than the spacer. So I'm going to go back and edit the page. And let's say perhaps we decide, okay, we don't need that space there. So I'm going to select the spacer and remove it. But instead, what I want is with my columns, I'm going to insert, oops, meant to grab all the columns. I'm going to insert something after the columns, and I want that to be the separator. And the separator defaults to just this solid line here. There's other options like making dots or what they call wide line. So I actually kind of like the dots. They're subtle, but still add that separation. But I'll just stick on the default for now. You can set the color of the line. You can see it just defaults to dark gray. So now if I update that and preview, oops. So we see now the separated line there, and you can put as many of those as you need wherever you need them. You can put them inside columns and whatever. So that would be the equivalent of what is known in the HTML world, the website world, as a horizontal rule. Okay. Now, oops, we'll go back here. So one additional, I keep clicking. So one additional block that I want to show is the page break block. So page break block is only really going to be useful for pages that have lots of content, but it's pretty easy to use. So let's say that I have a lot of content on my page, and I want them to see only just the first page of content and then see the rest of the content on a second page. It can just automatically handle that for you. So the first thing I would do is decide where I want that page break to be. So let's just say I want it to be between these two quotes here. And then I'm going to insert a what is it? Sorry, it's not coming up. Let's try this way. So that is interesting. I've used page, oops, I spelled it wrong there. So I honestly don't know why the page break option isn't coming up. It must somehow be disabled on this site. So I'm not going to be able to show that one. I'll go ahead and open up the instructions for it. So normally, like I said, I don't know why it's not coming up. But normally you would put a page break in and let's see, it shows in the editor. So what you should have seen. In the editor, it shows this page break line. And then when you actually view it, I don't know if they actually show it, it looks like on the front end. No, it doesn't. But when you actually view it, what it'll do in that location, it will put in essentially a little page numbers for each page that you can click on to jump to a page. So you can start out on page 1, jump to 2. So I'm gonna go back to the editor real quick since we do have time. And I'm gonna see if I can figure out why I'm not able to insert a page break. That is interesting. So I honestly am not sure why that is. I've was tested this out earlier on a different site at least, and it was there, and I've used that before. So something I'll have to look into. That's a fail for this particular workshop. But that being said, at least we were able to cover all the other ones that I expected to be there. So I'll go ahead, and at this point, we've actually are very early. I've got half hour early, so we have time to take questions if anybody has them. Any questions about the block editor or specific
I don't think I noticed how you you didn't change the name on the buttons. It just says button 1, button 2, button 3.
I mean, I just typed that in. You can change it to whatever you want. Yeah, I mean, so you literally just type in there what you want, and that's all it is. Let's see. Oh, actually, I do have a handout. Someone asked in the chat about the link to the presentation. I do have a handout that I'll post in the chat. That is it's basically just these slides. So it has all these links to these help articles, which are pretty easy to come by. But let me bring that up. All right, so that's the handout of the slides that I went over, which mainly is just this. It's just the 2 slides. Mainly this one here. Yeah, so I'll have to look into the page break thing. The only thing I've done since the page break one that I tested is I turned on the site origin page builder. So maybe for some reason it disables the page break option. I don't know. But other than that, they all should work for you. So I'll hang around. I'll continue taking questions if anybody has any. If not, again, thanks for attending, and I will hopefully see you at a future workshop.